have Nancy with us, Nancy Graham, who has flown in from the States. Well, you flew into Edinburgh on, what day is today now? Did you say Sunday? Saturday? You flew into Edinburgh.
Sunday. I left on Saturday.
You left on Saturday, yeah. Okay. So
this is Tuesday, I think. This is Tuesday.
Different time zones and lots of travel, but Nancy and I have met quite a few times before. We met at the previous History Society, but also in the research that she was doing for this terrific book, actually, was up and down at Augustine, where I'm serving as a minister, and where Erik Routley was also there. So there's a good chapter about Augustine in here, actually, which is wonderful, too. So Nancy is a hymnologist, a lecturer, and a church musician. Her doctorate in sacred music is from the Graduate Theological Foundation, the Foundation House in Oxford. She also has a Master's of Music from Westminster Choir College, so you're very balanced. Dr. Graham's publication, they've got several publications which are about African American spirituality, and they include The Bare Acquaintance, which was a study of African American spirituals, and Camp Meeting Songs. African American spirituals and the revised Common Lectionary, which is fascinating, and Spirituality by Heart in the Music and Spirituality series. As well as you've got entries in the Canterbury Directory of Hymnology. So you still live in Mobile, in Alabama?
Yes, ma'am.
In Alabama.
Down on the Gulf Coast, where it's about 90 degrees Fahrenheit today.
We'll come to cool down then. And she has served in congregations in Maryland, and New Jersey, and Tennessee, and Scotland. It is a real privilege to have you here. I know Nancy has said that she can talk for a long time about Erik Routley. We're really glad that somebody can. Because that was a big thing about this book, was lots of bits written about Erik, and Nancy has put together, she's compiled the biography so that we really have a good sense of his story, and it's a great read. Nancy, we're delighted you're here and really interested to hear what you have to say. So
Thank
welcome,
you.
thank you.
Thank you very much. And there's several of you I know in this room that I have bored to death with and battered to death with emails and personal visits and things for information and for corrections, and so I want to thank you very much. I also want to thank the History Society as a whole, because you probably don't remember because it seems like 100 years ago, but you gave me a very nice travel grant to enable my pretty much 18 months in the UK working on this project. Excuse me. As you can tell from what Fiona said, until I got this project, I knew who Erik Routley was. I had his textbooks in school and that sort of thing, and I respected him. But my area of expertise is African American spirituals and American hymnody, and there you go. But I ended up, and I'm going to tell you about it here, writing this project. It fell into my lap literally at the beginning of the pandemic lockdown. And so for a year and a half, I spent myself at the dining room table with Erik. And then once they let me out of the country, I met Fiona. So I also, before I start talking, I need to tell you that I have some vision issues. And so, and I have to read because otherwise I will go down a million rabbit holes on this subject. And in order to at least give you some information that I think you need, and not give you information that you don't want, I'm going to read. But my vision's horrible, and so bear with me. When I began writing this biography of Erik Routley, I knew very little about his reputation as a churchman in the UK, and even less about his role in the formation of this denomination. In the US, it is his dynamic preaching, his books on church leadership, worship, and the theology of music that attract our attention. We just think he was a minister, oh, by the way. And because of our romantic notion of everybody in England must be a member of the Church of England, Congregationalists never even entered the picture. Erik died suddenly in October of 1982, leaving many loose ends in the church music world. His wife, Margaret, was left sorting out his papers and deciding their resting place. He was a professor, which I'll get to, but at Westminster Choir College in Princeton, and at the time when he died. And so Margaret, she was overwhelmed, as I said. Routley was very organized, but the sheer volume of his output was overwhelming on such sudden notice. One Westminster Choir College is still home of the impressive, comprehensive Talbot Music Library. And Margaret approached the archivist at this library, whose name was also Nancy Wickland, asking her to help with the sorting and decision-making. In 1987, the college bought the papers, but again, the task of cataloging the information and making it available to research was overwhelming. You'll find I use the word overwhelming a lot for describing this man. But when the task was solidly underway by 1992, Margaret returned to England and asked Nancy, the other Nancy, if she would write the biography. So for nearly 30 years, Nancy collected articles, sermons, programs, personal items, but when she died in 2019, no book had materialized. And indeed, when I have searched through her records, she had written nothing. And I can admit that, I think, to this group because you didn't know her. But sometimes in the States, people go, you know, what do you mean she didn't write anything? Well, she did. So when she died, Nancy's husband, Ray, approached me for advice on what to do with her material. I had been a colleague and friend, so I agreed to visit their home and go through the material in her office. Now, she was one of these people that if one copy was good, 3 were better. So, I mean, we're talking, it was astonishing. When I arrived, I myself was overwhelmed at the mounds of paper on the floor, overstuffed bookshelves in the file cabinets, and a myriad of boxes of related memorabilia. As I said, as a church musician with a master's degree from Westminster, I respected the name Erik Routley. I had used his textbooks in class, but my academic work went in the direction of American religious folk hymnody, a subject of only passing interest to Routley. When I left the Wickland house that day, I shook my head and told Ray, I don't know what you're going to do with this. I don't know. Don't throw it out. It's important. It was the week before Christmas, 2019, and I said, I got to go home. Give me a minute to think, and I'll get back to you. So, I advised him to hang on to it. All right, where was I? Okay, in the meantime, Nicholas Routley, who is Erik's oldest son, who lives in Australia, sent in January of 2020, and these dates are important, in January of 2020, sent a letter of condolence from the Routley family and asked about, oh, by the way, what happened to the biography? Time number 1 when we have to say nothing. So, after Ray explained the situation, that both men wanted to move the project forward, and unbeknownst to me, true story, Ray sent the Routley family my CV. This began an immediate 6-week courtship between me and Nicholas. Repeatedly, I reluctantly and just adamantly denied I was not going to write this. Sorry. The project is huge. It's not my area. I respect everything, but I talked to people in this country, particularly Dick Watson here at Durham and all over the place, and they said, oh, run the other way. Just, So I continued, and Nicholas kept saying, oh, but you're so blah. This is one superlative after another. And it was March 9th, and in our country, lockdown became March 12th. So it was March 9th, and I received a phone call from a man who wrote the introduction in the book. His name is Carlton Young, and he is a very important Methodist hymnologist, liturgist, editor of hymnals in the United States, and he and Erik worked together for 20 years. Love-hate relationship, mostly love. But, so the phone rang, and I saw Sam Young, and went, oh my God, it's like Elvis on the phone. Sam Young, why is he calling me? And you didn't know him, but I think really he was a lot like Erik. He was 94 years old at the time, and he hollered into the phone, Nancy, I understand you're writing the biography of Erik Routley. See, Sam, thank you for calling. I can't believe, thank you very much, but no, I'm not. He said, no, he said, you must write it. He said, it has to be written now or it will never be written. So if you don't write it, it won't get done. And he then said, Erik Routley could be an arrogant pain in the neck, but everything that came out of his mouth was important and unique. So I was like, okay, Sam, I'll write the book. And then about an hour later, I got another email from Nicholas. And I said, all right, flattery will get me everywhere, Nicholas. I will take it on, but only tentatively. Give me 6 months. And if at the end of 6 months, I just think I can't do this, then I need to say sorry. Now, the Routleys did not control anything about this book, who, what, where, why, what materials I used, or anything like that, except that they did specify that it should be a biography. Because because he died so quickly, and because there's probably people in this room who knew him, there really hadn't been necessarily a need. There was a need for a biography, but no one had gotten around to do it. So there was only one book written about Erik before this one was written, and that's a book called Duty and Delight, which some of you have probably read. It was compiled almost during his memorial service at Westminster Abbey in London in 1983 by his colleagues from here and in the United States. And it's 17 of colleagues, some of whom you know, and, well, I'll get to that at the end. Anyway, so that was the only book that was written. So this is a tribute to Routley's work and legacy through the eyes of his friends and colleagues. Though the Routley family, I already said this, we'll do that. Even in the early days, it was apparent that writing this book would require constant refocusing to keep this his biography and not a summation of his legacy or his theology. So I didn't know where to begin or how to begin, and I looked to Routley himself and began reading his work. Two words that Routley used repeatedly, be they letters, books, sermons, were splendid and trajectory. And whether he was in awe of the glory of God, satisfied after a sumptuous meal, impressed with his children's school progress, observing a colleague's success, his ebullient reply was often splendid, just splendid. And I have it just like that on recordings. But trajectory went deeper. From the history of Christian worship to the detective novel, Routley was nearly obsessed with how something started and where it ended up. And you may know that Routley was a true fan of the detective novel and was a member of Agatha Christie's Detective Society and wrote a theological study of detective novels, and mostly because he was just really anxious to see where it would go. Who did it? How could it happen? So hence trajectory, and he says it all the time. So this paper will be a very condensed look at how his faithful pragmatism, insistence on moving forward, and provocative ideas are still, as Durham's Dick Watson says, the yardstick by which the discussion of hymns is measured. Routley's academic, musical, and congregational trajectories burst into life in Brighton. John Routley came from deep nonconformist roots in Somerset, and when he married his wife Eleanor, they were members of the Queen Street Congregational Church, which later became the Union Square Church. John served as church secretary for nearly 20 years, while Eleanor was choir director and organist. They had high expectations for their only child, and to this end, at age 8, Erik boarded at Fonthill School, just north of the city. And it was while at Fonthill that he discovered that an entire other set of hymns used in their daily chapel services existed. Fascinating. Erik studied their 1889 hymns A and M during the services, where he also was first introduced to the liturgical drama in Anglican worship. He went home to Brighton every weekend and eagerly compared Fonthill's book to worship song, which they used both in Brighton and at his home. And he also compared the centricity of the sermon in congregational worship to the attention to the liturgy in the Anglican services. The idea of clergy and musicians being artists and his thoughts on the relationship between theology and music subtly entered his consciousness at this point. With the help of his Fonthill teacher, he began to sketch out new tunes for texts that he liked, and filled them in a notebook which also contained pages which he tore out of old hymnals, of hymns that he liked. What a guy. So this habit or hobby continued right up to his first ministerial assignment in Wednesbury. And it was there, and when he received the invitation to join the Committee on Congregational Praise, Erik and the Wednesbury organist spent many evenings taking all these hymns and organizing them with cutting, pasting, and filing and giving them titles. And at Eric's first meeting with the hymnal committee, another true story, buried by George Caird, so he wouldn't lie, he plopped this notebook on the table and said, "Gentlemen, here is your hymnal." True story. His momentum picked up in 1931. He entered Lansing College. Over 4 years, Routley's path to academic and music were strengthened under the tutelage of 3 men, Jasper Rupert, Alexander Brent Smith, and the Reverend William Howlett. It was they who oversaw the music in chapel at Lansing during his matriculation. In a lecture 50 years later, Routley remembered, "There never was such an improbable trio. Brent Smith, a composer and brilliant organist who hated the organ, Rupert, a genius at getting music out of other people, and Howlett, who cherished the liturgy with a great and simple love." Initially, it was Brent Smith who threw Routley onto the organ bench for many of the twice daily chapel services, and when Rupert replaced Brent Smith, Routley maintained this assignment and was challenged with new skills of improvisation, playovers, and alternative accompaniments. At Lansing, the 1922 Hymns A&M, as well as the English hymnal, were used at the twice daily services. And Erik realized quickly that comparing these hymnals to worship song would get him through many a dull sermon back in Brighton. By the time Routley was 18, he had memorized and analyzed all 4 hymn books, cementing his value on hymnal editorial teams, whatever the denomination. The pulpit at Queen Street Square, had been vacant for the last 2 years of Routley's stay at Lansing, giving him the opportunity to observe and critique content, style, and delivery sermons from some of the weekly supply preachers, most of them very well known. A self-proclaimed Anglican snob, the teenage Erik Routley found the preachers so dry and pedantic that he usually fled back to Lansing immediately after lunch. But one Sunday, in conversation at breakfast, John Routley remarked about the preacher for the day, a Douglas Langridge, about whom he knew nothing, but he came from Lions Walk in Colchester with very fine recommendations. So Erik went off to the worship with no concept that his fledgling theology and vocational trajectories were about to powerfully meld for the rest of his life. Langridge's straightforward style, command of vocabulary, and powerful delivery prompted Routley to remark later, "This was the first preacher I listened to. The first one who wouldn't let my mind wander. The first one who said what I was longing to hear. He brought Jesus right into the room." Routley went home to lunch, where he announced to his astonished parents, "I'm going back to the evening service." Langridge, though compelling and controversial, was hired, and within a few weeks, Routley told his parents, "That's the job I want to do." Routley left Lansing for Magdalen College, where he heard another sermon with profound effect. At St. Mary's in Oxford, Routley attended an evening worship one June where the popular Don C.S. Lewis gave a memorable sermon. Today we call that sermon Weight of Glory. It holds the premise that glory exists for the realization that God is delighted by humankind, as an artist delights in his work. This concept is echoed in much of Routley's own writing as the necessary element for honesty in Christian worship. Routley challenged every preacher or public speaker to study this example of Lewis's poetic oral expression. And this is the example. "At present, we are on the outside of the world, the wrong side of the door. We discern the freshness and purity of morning, but they do not make us fresh and pure. We cannot mingle with the splendors we see, but all the leaves of the New Testament are rustling with the rumor that it will not always be so. And Routley used this example over and over in his sermon classes, saying that most of these words, this is what made Lewis Lewis. Most of these words are of one syllable, and the startling contrast of the two-syllable words is what make Lewis's sermons so remarkable. I spent a lot of time looking at stuff since I was reading that after I read that. Needing familiarity, nonconformist students in Oxford were often drawn to worship at Mansfield College and remember this is right before the war started, this is in the late 1930s. And Routley was no exception. Here the trajectory recharges with Erik's introduction to Nathaniel Micklem, principal of the college. Micklem and Douglas Langridge had gone to Mansfield together 30 years before, and Langridge sent a letter to Micklem introducing Routley as a brilliant mind that bore watching and cultivating. Micklem, another strong but controversial theologian, carefully mentored Routley into the Congregational ministry though the strength of Micklem's guidance was not clear to Routley until many years later. Micklem officiated at Routley's ordination in Westminster in 1943, and aware of his protege's remarkable understanding of hymnology and church history, he encouraged Routley to join the Hymn Society, and then recommended that Routley be placed on the committee that produced Congregational Praise. This committee, led by Kenneth Perry and Eric Tiemann, soon found that this young new minister had an incomparable knowledge of hymns and strong thoughts about music and worship. So they quickly made him secretary. That's what you get. I wonder if they were sorry. Arguably, however, the Micklem that had the most spiritual influence on Erik was Nat's brother, Romilly. Romilly was Routley's first chaplain while he was still a Magdalen student, and his strong influence on Routley's spiritual side lasted his entire life. Romilly, though, was burdened with health issues, but he became essentially Routley's spiritual advisor and confidant during the difficult years of Routley's early ministries. This role was reversed. Romilly asked Erik to look after his son Carol in the same way. Though tested, the relationship between these two men had an unbreakable bond that lasted their entire lives. 1948 brought two more events into the Routley trajectory. An ecumenical meeting in Geneva produced the World Council of Churches, a movement and organization important to Routley for the rest of his life, and secondly, Mansfield College was enduring another of many tumultuous episodes of controversy, and this one centered around the McKennell Chair of History, which was vacated by the death of Cecil Cadew. The Mansfield Council could not compromise on the theological direction of the position, so Micklem recommended that the new editor of the Hymn Society Bulletin and Mansfield man Erik Routley be offered the position. This set off a wave of protest surrounding his academic and theological output. But times were tough, and as we know, insecure finances are often the catalyst for decision-making. Due to other faculty retirements and changes, the college needed a director of chapel, a chaplain, an organist, a librarian, and an instructor of church history. So, ever the pragmatic council, they offered all of this to Routley in one position, minus the McKennell chair. That was the compromise. Nope, can't do it. So, Routley, and it was a 5-year contract. So Routley was still working on his DPhil, and he had a young family and unsteady ministerial experience, so he accepted immediately. Not the least perk, though, was housing nearby, ironically or not, once the home of several Micklems. We're trying to get a blue plaque placed on that house, by the way. It was then, with this Mansfield experience, that Routley's initial trajectories united and established the course of his next 30 years. He gained his DPhil, the source of many of his books. He created and organized the Congregational and Oxford organ guilds, He penned 3 well-received books, wrote the Organist's Companion to the newly completed Congregational Praise, fulfilled his Mansfield duties, including a powerful sermon class and vibrant and still memorable chaplaincy. This room's too young, I do believe. Oh. But there are...
just got to Oxford the term when he went away to Newcastle.
Oh. Well, there are the folks that I talked to who are well into their 90s, but he was their chaplain, just remember him with a smile on their face immediately. No matter who, every time I would say, well, what can you tell me? They would just burst into smile and say something like, he changed my life forever. So where was I? So while I was doing that, he wrote regular articles. Are you exhausted yet? For the British Weekly, the Congregational Journal and Congregational Monthly, the Minister's Bulletin, the Bulletin of the Hymn Society. Plus, he preached in many pulpits, and though never a member, was active at the Congregational Church in Summertown. Upon Micklam's retirement in 1953, the new principal, John Marsh, renewed Routley's contract, including the mechanical chair. Which still people didn't like it, though, whatever. They didn't want the job, though. But Mansfield was changing, and Routley was restless, and the vibes of another trajectory were starting to form. Various Mansfield professors lectured in North American universities after the war, and 2 of Erik's most famous books, Hymns in the Faith and Hymns in Human Life, often went with them, introducing his fresh and inspiring theology to America. By 1955, these connections in Toronto, Chicago, and New York City organized a whirlwind 2-week speaking tour, including McGill, Macalester, Emmanuel College, Harvard, the University of Chicago, the Lutheran School of Theology, and, probably most importantly for this part, the School of Sacred Music at Union Seminary in New York. Several people that Erik met during this tour created speaking opportunities to occur within the next 7 or 8 years. Emmanuel College offered a permanent faculty position, which Erik regretfully declined, much to John Marsh's relief. But the winds of change were quite strong over the next 2 years. Some of Routley's most important books on the themes of music and theology were published, as well as several requested by the CCEW and the still important book on the English Carol. Augustine Bristow in Edinburgh was searching for a dynamic preacher, and by 1959, with some sadness over leaving Oxford and his English connections, he relocated his family and his aspirations to Scotland. Despite the demands and responsibilities of congregational ministry in downtown Edinburgh and the needs of his family, Routley squeezed in time to write and nurture new personal and professional relationships. Theology and church musicians from North America visited on sabbatical, and ecumenical opportunities in Scotland asked for his help. 1962 was a pivotal year for the music of Christian worship in general, and Dr. Routley in particular. Society's huge fluctuations into secular concerns caused the church to explore different, new, yet faithful directions in worship practice. A primary example was the Second Vatican Council, where a large part of the discussion was devoted to the restructuring of Roman Catholic liturgy and worship. George Caird was the congregational representative to these meetings in Rome. In Scotland, an ecumenical effort came to fruition through the Scottish Church's House in Dunblane. Ian Fraser, the warden, tapped Routley to help turn the Protestant hymnody concerns into a series of consultations that resulted in Routley's famous quote, 2 actually, that we are meeting the church at its growing points and what has been termed the hymn explosion. Now the hymn explosion is often used to, we think of that because so many hymns, thousands of hymns came after these consultations, and that's one way to look at it. But I think more importantly, it was a hymn explosion of the hymn itself, because it was a complete reconstruction of hymns from their content and form to their accompaniments. Denominations and religious organizations began assembling supplements to their standard hymnals, and Routley was usually approached for advice. By this time, he was closely connected to John Wilson, another 20th century giant in church music, and the two of them exposed the hymns of Brian Wren, Fred Kahn, and Fred Pratt Green to now the global hymnody. They also supported and introduced Carol Micklem, Peter Cutts, Alan Luff, Alan Gaunt, and so many others who became important figures in reimagined worship music, and especially in the URC. In North America, two engagements arranged in the 1955 conference brought Routley to the Princeton Theological Seminary and the Presbyterian-sponsored Montreat Worship and Music Conferences. And remember, this is still 1962. Erik was he would do this, spend time with them for the next 20 years. Erik was a regular lecturer and preacher at their summer workshops, and still, Erik was only able to do this outside of his professional commitments to the congregation in Edinburgh and the city itself. Foundational ideas of the United Reformed Church were being acted upon in English congregational churches. Planned and necessary new directions in Edinburgh and in the church, and plus Routley's increasing desire to write and the coming empty nest made him restless again. The English Congregationalists wanted him back in England, and when in 1967 the pastor at St. James's in Newcastle became available, he was offered the position and accepted. You know better than I the whirlwind of planning and subsequent debate and compromise within the congregations and administrations of both the CCEW and the English Presbyterians in anticipation of their union in 1972. And now I'm going to read you a section from the book, largely substantiated by my friend Michael back there. Oop, wrong place. Oh, I'm done, Nancy. I moved the bookmark, sorry. Here it is. Old hands. At the May meeting in 1969, the CCEW elected Routley as their president for the 1970 to 1971 term. Among congregations, hope grew that choosing Routley would put a new emphasis on the prophetic nature of the church, rather than the ecclesiastical jockeying that had lately accompanied much of every denominational activity. And this quote I'm going to read now is from the minutes of that meeting. Neither friend nor critic would be surprised to find Routley president over any society for purpose of music, hymnody, or worship, that we should have selected such a downright, no-nonsense, outspoken, blow away the cobwebs, Chestertonian type of man to be president of our church does us quite as much honor and credit as it does to him. We owe more to him than we are aware, and he is one of the liveliest and most theologically trenchant preachers. His sense of humor and sweeping honesty of mind have no respect of persons, sorry for my eyesight, of persons, but his pastoral care knows no limits. Routley was in the thick of it. He perceived that careful communication was the key to a reasonable transition, and there was a lot of explaining and reassuring to be done. The president's responsibility was to represent the denomination in interchurch gatherings and lead all business meetings of the assembly, but his title did not come with membership on the joint negotiating committee or any voting role. Accompanied by his foresight, drive, and persuasive leadership, he visited untold numbers of congregations, offering encouragement, understanding, and explanations of the coming changes. The man who was moderator of the General Assembly, the English Presbyterian, was a man named Arthur MacArthur. And he also was a minister in the Newcastle area. And so he and Erik knew each other in the midst of all of this. And this is what he writes. There could be no more fitting person than Erik Routley to guide Congregationalists towards the transition of the next few years. With a conviction of unfragmented faith, Routley refused to be bound by outworn traditions, though equally unwilling to adopt modern methods that he deemed unworthy or meretricious. Let's see here. Alexander, the two had different roles and venues, but were frequently at the same meetings and others sounding board as the path to union was inevitable at this point. Final agreement was reached in 1972, and the obligatory bill of establishment was put before the House of Commons that June. The two men, upon waking the morning of October 5th, the Presbyterian MacArthur and the Congregationalist Routley, found themselves both ministers of the United Reformed Church. In the first United Agenda, Routley was appointed chair of Doctrine and Worship Committee. MacArthur says, "This was a strategic appointment, helpful to carry us on from the worship patterns of the separate churches at a time when there was a movement of change in terms of theological thinking brought about by the disturbing questions raised by Bishop John Robinson in his book, Honest to God. We needed Erik's strong faith to help us build bridges with the familiar." During these years, Routley tried to keep the speaking engagements in the United States to a minimum, but he edited several hymnals and supplements in the UK and US. And this was all done without Zoom calls and Wikipedia and all of those kinds of things, email. He was summoned by the World Council of Churches also to produce a newly conceived version of their hymnal Cantate Domino. Still committed to the duty and delight of glorifying God and enjoying God forever, however, Routley was experiencing health issues and wanted time to focus on writing, composing, and teaching. He recognized that St. James's needed a minister who could closely shepherd the congregation into the new denomination. For 15 years, Erik had experienced a close connection with the Presbyterian Church in the U.S., and in 1974, the Princeton Seminary extended an invitation to become visiting professor of liturgy and hymnology. And across town, Westminster Choir College, the renowned school of church music, offered to extend the seminary's offering with another year. Erik had participated in many seminars and conferences in both places and gratefully accepted this offer to teach what he wanted to teach to students who wanted to learn the same. In January of 1975, Erik and Margaret moved to Princeton for what they assume would be an 18-month commitment, but the Choir College renewed Erik's contract several times and eventually granted him tenure in the spring of 1982. He intended to take a sabbatical term in January of '83 and teach the required one more year. But this rich and satisfying apex to the main trajectory that began in Brighton in 1917 stopped abruptly on October 8th, 1982, at a conference in Nashville, leaving many, many bereft and unprepared friends, colleagues, and family members. And that's his basic trajectory. But I would like to address a couple of things that folks have questioned, or in reading the book. And one is his legacy. And I think if you read the book, not even very carefully, his legacy jumps out at you. I mean, you can't help it. You can't separate the man from what he was. And his multiple editorial ventures, which, as I explained to people in the States who kind of get ho-hummy about when I say he was an editor of a hymnal, the editor of a hymnal controls what you're going to be singing for the next 100 years, or however long that lasts. And the hymns that we think are beloved, we have to have these hymns or we will die, were the choice of some editor back in the day. So we forget, that how important he was and the foresight that was necessary to select the hymns that are still vibrant today. Like I said, all of Fred Pratt Green's and Wren and Fred Kahn are in our country, and also know over here are in all the 21st century hymnals and supplements. And the book Duty and Delight, which I referred to, not only do these 17 people in their comment on sort of what Erik Routley means to them in terms of their legacy, what they do, and these are ministers and hymnologists and professors and church musicians. But also, in the back of this book is an astonishing, comprehensive, pretty much complete, as much as it could possibly be, many pages, 10, 15 pages of the books that he wrote, the articles that he wrote, some of his speaking engagements, some of his sermons, recordings, positions, all of the compositions, hymns. And so if you want to know anything that Erik Routley wrote or did, check there first. The book is called Duty and Delight, and it was published in 1985 by Robin Lever, who I know you recognize that name. The folks that are in there, George Caird, Carol Micklem, Fred Pratt Green, John Wilson, so they all have their perspective on what Erik Routley left to them. I kind of alluded to this. So back in the day, when I was at Westminster, and Erik Routley had been dead. Erik had been dead for 5 years, but he was legend. I mean, everything was Erik Routley this, Erik Routley that, Erik Routley potatoes, Erik Routley, furniture, Erik Routley, Erik Routley, Erik Routley, and I was, yeah, all right, righto. And Duty and Delight had just been published. And so to be supportive, I bought a copy. Yes, I got this. And I never read it. And I never read it, and I never read it. And when I moved in 2019, the summer of 2019, from Memphis to Mobile, Alabama, I culled my books one more time, and I held Duty and Delight in my hand and said, I'm never going to read this. So I put it in the pile to send to the Hymn Society. And 6 months later, that was the first book I bought. So that's his legacy, and his legacy is everywhere. Now, also, when it comes to his theology, granted, the book is, for lack of a better term, weak on theology. I don't really address the issue very much, for I think reasons that you will understand. It's huge. It's huge. I mean, in my opinion, to adequately address what I'm calling here his trajectories in his life as to how he got where he got, and then to interject the theology at different points would simply confuse both issues. So, and I'm not a theologian. I've studied a lot and I've had a lot of theological type training and teachers and that sort of thing, but I have not really read the books that I know that influenced him, of the theologians of the day, from Micklem to Reinhold Niebuhr and Karl Barth and Bonhoeffer and all of those. I've read some of them, but not enough to comment on them. So, on the other hand, I do recognize that what good is a biography if you don't know why you need to read it? If you don't know who's Erik Routley? And indeed, this Montreat Music and Worship Conference that I refer to, I'm on the faculty of there now, thanks to this book, actually. But in Routley's day, it was a 3-week consecutive, three 1-week sessions that ran consecutively, the end of June, on music and worship. And he was frequently the minister, a lecturer, leader of hymn sings, and that sort of thing. And so, where was I going with this? See what I told you about having to write it down? Anyway, there it is. But at Montreat, anyway, back to his theology. So, I know what it was. So when I was starting to write this book, and I am a Presbyterian and member of this whole outfit over there, and people would ask me what I'm doing, and I would say, I'm writing the book on Erik Routley. And they'd say, their eyes would glaze over. And I would say, I know you've never heard of him. And at Montreat, when he died very suddenly in 1982, in the fall, I heard him speak in the summer of 1982 at Montreat at age like, I don't know, do the math, 23 or something like that. I was probably older than that, but he was but I had no idea he was Erik Routley. And so the next summer in 1983, he had died and he was scheduled. I mean, and I did go to that conference, and I do remember the aura at that point was it was awake. It was because, for a lot of reasons. One, they were just bereft about, their beloved pastor. But another reason was because communications were different then, and there were a lot of people that showed up at those conferences and didn't know that he had died. And they had come expecting to hear him and then wasn't there. So the Presbyterian Association of Musicians organized a foundation fund called the Routley Lecturers. And what these lectures do is every year at these conferences now, they allow for a famous or well-known hymnologist, hymnologist, theologian, whatever, fits into the description of the conferences at that time, and they give 2 lectures a day for 2 weeks, plus do these hymn things, which is a huge job. Fortunately, I'm just a consultant, I don't have to do that. But anyway, when I would tell these people that, oh, I'm writing about Erik Routley, they'd say, no, I've never heard of him, but does he have anything to do with the Routley lectures? Yes, he does. So anyway, so back to with that in mind, what I'm not sure who the publisher is going to be, but what we're doing is, at my discretion, and if any of you have some advice on this, I would gladly take it, excerpts from sermons or articles or his books or something that can be put into, for lack of a better word, a study guide. That's not really what it is, but with questions at the end so that you can actually see what his theological themes are, and also with reference to those articles of where to go for more information and which books you might want to read on, which particular theme that you're dealing with. And I have brought, what did I do in there? Oh, right now we have 2 selected, and one I brought with me, and I don't have enough for all of you, but you can certainly take one and pass it around or whatever, and if anyone would want one and doesn't get to take one home from this, I can easily send it to you on PDF. And what this is titled Music and Reformed Worship by Erik Routley, and this appeared in the 1951 March edition of the Minister's Bulletin in the Congregational Church. Now the man was like 33, and he wrote this astonishing article, I thought, and still do think, on the dangers of church music. Which, there you go, that's Routley at his finest. Sure to get your attention. And I thought, well, maybe I'll just call the book The Dangers of Church Music. His theology introduces the article. I did happen to bring the original with me, so if anybody would like to see it. This is all him, but what I have done, I've abridged it, and I've just sort of either updated some of his colloquial references nobody understands anymore. I mean, from like things that were going on in Mansfield in 1951, which maybe you might know, nobody would remember. But it's all him. I have not interpreted any of this. These are his thoughts. And if you're wondering about the dangers of church music after all of his Routleyisms, this is what he says. People in the States have their mouths dropped. Because, let me explain that. The problem with Routley today, I have found, is that we have become a much more literal society than we were in those days. And folks, at least that I come in contact with in universities and stuff, they're really not used to arguing. They are not used to discussing. They're used to telling their point and then leaving. And that's what it is. And so when folks, particularly students, read his textbooks and things, their first thought is not to think about what he says. Their first thought is, well, that's not right. We don't have to do that. He's wrong, he's crazy on that. But that was never his point. His point was never to offer what he thought needed to be done. His point was always, let me put this out there for you, and just think about it. The first and more common way in which music can damage worship is a consequence of the fact that music appeals to reason if we let it, and to our emotions whether we let it or don't. The composition of music is a process consisting very largely of pure reason, but music appeals to our mind and can be sifted and censored by our critical faculties only if we make a conscious effort to understand its vocabulary. If we don't, it goes right past our mind to our affections, and from there to our will. And the point there is that congregational members generally do not have the musical vocabulary and experience that you might have if you went to an opera or something like that, that our focus as worship goers is different. We sing the hymns, but we don't necessarily pay attention to the compositional elements and that sort of stuff. And so our response is, oh, I really like that. Or, oh, I can't stand that. That's terrible. And as an organist, I have had people come up and say, if we do that hymn again, I'm not coming. Okie dokie. And then the other is the opposite. The other danger of music is that which is offered not to the illiterate, and he uses words like that tend to offend people. I'm not illiterate. Fine. But to the cultivated. Organists, choirs, hymnologists, ministers, connoisseurs, and experts of all sorts are open to the temptation of allowing culture to replace revelation and interest to supplant penitence. So the way he breaks it down is the I don't like it versus that's not good enough. So then, and this I just want to read one more thing here. He then talks about, and I referred to this in here, about that it's important to keep the discussion going. It's important to keep talking. It's important to keep all of these issues that we have in church music and in worship, which we've had for hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years, which are still relevant. I don't like it versus it's not good enough. So that we can keep the discussion going and not be stuck. We are never told to disparage the world of time. And he gives some biblical references here. To be contemptuous of our mortal neighbors, but we are told to keep moving. The great danger seems to be getting stuck, staying on the mount, building tabernacles, mistaking pleasant scenery for the promised land, and happy experiences for the beatific vision. I usually have to explain that to the Protestants in the United States. I seem to hear the voice of a modern prophet taking up the tale, bondage to buildings, bondage to the past, and bondage to worldliness. And then he goes on in here, and these are some of the questions in here, to explain the positions of the organist and the choir and the hymns and psalms and all of those kinds of things. So this may be of interest to you. I also have, this is a real practical thing, this is a hardbound academic book, which translates into, it's expensive. It's cheaper in this country, actually, than the United States, which is surprising to me. What's also surprising, if you go on eBay or things like that, it's more expensive to buy it used than it is to buy it brand new. So I happen to have these little cards here that say, this is my, sales pitch, with a 30% off code on back if you order it from the publisher. So you're welcome to have one of those. So now, before I open it up to questions, I would like to read one last thing from your colleague and friend, Carol Mifflin. I've got a lot of time, don't I?
It's 5 to 10, but it doesn't.
What time are we done?
Coffee's at 10:30.
So we're okay.
Can you hold on?
Oh,
All right.
Thank you.
Carol gave the editor, okay, this is from Carol Mifflin. Eric, and I get real emotional, just sorry. He became my friend after 4 years of me and Eric at the dining room table and nobody else because of COVID. And when I got to the writing part in the summer of 1982, I found myself every time getting totally overwhelmed with emotion and sadness, but not because I knew he was going to die, because people die, and I'm writing a book about a dead guy, so he was going to die. But what was affecting me was that I knew that these folks that were so involved with him during the months before, particularly with the hymnal Rejoice in the Lord and all of those things, were about to be thoroughly flattened. And even right this minute. It was just more than I could handle. So this is from Carol. Erik was Erik. You could not slow him down, and though all who loved him feel irreparable loss, he gives us new notion of everlasting rest. Erik could convey the mystery and wonder of the glory of God, as well as he could relay the compelling down-to-earthness of the Bible. This thrusting, self-assertive, know-it-all man was perpetually awestruck. He spoke of what he knew, devoting all of himself to getting out of the way, to let us see what he had seen. Thank you.
Nancy, thank you. That went quickly, actually, so thank you. You were worried about speaking too long, but there was so much in it that was completely fascinating, and I'm so curious to read this as well. So, do folk have some questions that would like to ask Nancy?
Not questions, just a comment to underline what you said. I remember that the student university societies of Presby Comstocks, Free Church societies, in Sheffield we had joint meetings, and in Sheffield we got Erik Routley to come, and he was exactly as you describe him. At breakfast, this is in the Hall of Residence, he was almost unbearably ebullient.
You can take one of these, pass it around if you want to or not. One of the things that convinced me that I was in the right place at the right time was the amazing things that happened along the way and things that people said. I have a friend in Edinburgh who I've known for 25 years, and when I was up there doing research for the first time, I was staying at a friend of mine's house. She wasn't there, and she let me stay, and the guy who lived upstairs, who I'd also known for 25 years, called me up one night and said, I'm going to bring a bottle of wine down. I said, okay. And I said, yeah, sure. So he came down and we're, conversing, and he said, so what are you working on, Nancy? And it's like, oh, don't ask me that. It's a guy you've never heard of, he's an English church musician, whatever. And he kept saying, well, what's his name? I said, you don't know him. What's his name? I said, Erik Routley. He said, oh, I know Erik Routley. He and my dad were best friends. And the thing is, I knew the story of his dad, of Erik's friend, but I had no idea that this guy was his son. And he was the friend was a man named Ralph Bell, who had a parish in Northumbria, or a congregation in Northumbria, and then ended up with like a conference center in the yes, exactly. And Erik, they came in touch because of chaplaincy and all those kinds of things, and they spent hours together. Apparently, Erik would run away from St. James's to go out there and bring a child or two, or something like that. So, and one of his books is actually dedicated to Ralph. So, there you go. So that happened all the time.
Any other questions or observations? Because I'm sure quite a lot of people, as Nancy's already said, in the room.
Yes.
Do you have any thoughts or any information about his views on psalm singing and how that should be conducted?
Yes.
In congregational praise, it's all pointed, what we generically call Anglican chants.
And that's one of the things that I think is really neat about the guy, is he was willing to change, is that he himself didn't get stuck. And he refers to, as much as he loved and pushed congregational praise and its cutting edgeness at the time, he later, by the time the Dublin music consultations came about, he acknowledged that just doing the pointed psalms was not the way to get the most out of congregational psalm singing that you could. And one of the proclamations or something of Vatican II was today something that we consider just normal, responsorial psalm singing with congregations. Leader singing, and then you sing the response back and forth. And after congregational praise was published, the hymns of Father Gelano became available, or we were aware of in the Taizé community and that sort of thing. So Erik was always about the congregation, always. And as a matter of fact, in this pamphlet, when he talks about church choirs, he says that you might be interested to know that at his funeral there was no choir, it was just the congregation in a very plain chapel, which, and it says in the book, Sam Young talks about it, but the fact that it was obviously, I'm sorry, maybe an emotional about this again, but it was his congregational roots. Because there's nothing like, I mean, singing at Westminster Choir College and singing the hymns with them, I mean, they're just absolutely glorious. Everybody can read music, everybody has pitch, everybody knows it, so it's just this whole thing. But during the Dunblane music consultations, they did an awful lot of experimentation with different ways to present the Psalms. And so, a very almost flip thing to say about what he thought about congregation participation is, if it works for your congregation, do it as long as it remains an honest form of worship and an honest proclamation of, in that case, the Psalms, but then particularly leading to the gospel.
Was there not a bit of a story about that in when, did he not use the Psalms of Augustine for a bit, and then
Yeah.
Charlie.
It's like, well, when they went to Augustine, the question was on which hymnal to use, and I'm trying to think which ones they were. Hymnary, maybe whatever the hymnary was at that time, whatever the congregational hymnary was, versus congregational praise. And he wanted congregational praise, of course. And the Augustine Bistro were like,
Not buying your copies.
no, we're not buying your copies. No, we're not doing it. Sorry, guy. So what he did was what we all do, those of us who are worship leaders, he just would supplement. He would make copies, which in those days, again, was not easy to do. Get copies and introduce psalm singing, sort of a calm response in front of the congregation, and it succeeded, or something. But the comment that Fiona's referring to is, there was a man, was he church secretary?
He was Charles Somerville, yeah, very influential within Congregationalism in Scotland.
Yeah.
Charlie, he was many things, but he was church secretary, I think, while Routley was there, yeah.
Well, anyway, those two were friends, and they loved to sit and smoke a pipe and have a whiskey into the real deep hours discussing theological stuff. And there came a time that the population had increased at Augustine, and we're going to buy new hymnals, or we need new hymnals, or whatever. And so Charlie was like, all right, maybe we could go to congregational praise. And Erik's push was, then congregational praise, there were psalms, and he wanted to sing psalms. And it's in the book, but anyway, in the other hymnal there wasn't. And Charlie's response was, well, we sing so many bloody psalms anyway. Why do we need a separate book? So it was, incidentally, I don't know that I've told you this, but there's many things in my discussion with Fiona that are still happening at Augustine that kind of got their start when Routley was there, except for the tune Augustine, which is no longer sung at Augustine United Church, but it's the only tune that we use in the States to let all the world in every corner sing. We don't know Luckington. We don't want to learn Luckington. Y'all can keep Luckington. And we don't necessarily have a loyalty to Erik as much as we just don't want Luckington. So we sing Augustine all the time. But also the concept of family suppers. And when Erik left, I have a recording of his Last Supper at Augustine, and it is hysterical. Because apparently, and those of you that know him might know this, he loved to do, little sort of Gilbert and Sullivan type ditty kind of things about all kinds of issues, particularly in and around Edinburgh. And there was a hilarious hymn at the piano singing about St. Augustine and St. James on the golf course. And it's hilarious. So I have that on tape, which I would like to give to you. So.
It's an amazing cocktail of a man to be so pastoral, so full of humour, so theologically rigorous, and so musically able. I mean, all those things together make for quite an interesting.
At the Summertown Summertown Church congregation. His friend Jeffrey Beck was the minister there, and when Erik went back to Mansfield, as he was wont to do, he announced that he was not going to become a member. Jeffrey said fine, but he attended all the time, and his family loved the church. But Erik refused to join, and a lot of Mansfield folks went to, which you probably know, went to Summertown, and but Jeffrey had a daughter who had a club foot, and she was young, like 2 or 3 or something like that, requiring weekly medical treatment in London. And Routley, unbeknownst to anybody, organized a 2-year rota for people to take Jeffrey's wife and his daughter into London, and then presented it to Jeffrey and said, "Here, this might help you out." So that's his pastoral sign. Anyone that knew, I mean, his pastoral, and even I say that Mansfield College and Westminster Choir College were bookends. Neither college exists in its form that it did when he was there, but Mansfield College being essentially his first congregation, his chaplaincy period, his first congregation, and Westminster Choir College being his final one. And any of the students who had him are now 60 years old, but they all say, "Oh yeah, his classes were spectacular. He knew so much about church history and blah, 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 blah." But it was chapel. And then they talk about sermons that he gave, or the chapel services, and he transformed that chapel service at Westminster from what had essentially been, a student recital of sacred music once a week to a chapel service. And it was Tuesday morning at 10 o'clock, and it was done at 10:35, and he, without fail, and he got it all in there, including choral, organ pieces and his sermon and hymns, and the succinctness of it. The population of a chapel service went from something like 12 to 300. And that's why his funeral, he died on Friday, his funeral was on Tuesday, and it was Tuesday morning at 10 o'clock. So that's real important to us Westminster people. But and they were the same. They were the same kind of college. They were both established for a certain purpose. Mansfield for the ministry, and Westminster for church music. And they evolved. They had a great 60, 75-year run, and then they changed, which they do. So I think that's a real important demarcation.
You said also, folk have got a question about, I'll come to that. You said also that you felt that I was trying to find exactly the quote, but again, even today, an understanding of shaping hymnology, that he has left a legacy, and you said 3 things. It was like his pragmatism, and I can't remember the other bits you put, but the sense that hymnology today is still shaped by his. Yeah. Could you expand that a wee bit more? I mean, you've talked about the legacies and the printed legacy. There's the shaping so many hymns by editing them. Are there particular flavours or something that come out that you can distinctly see are part of Erik's legacy?
One of them is on hymn writing itself. And are you familiar with the letter that Brian Wren wrote to Erik when he wrote his very first hymn after leaving Mansfield? And then Erik responded, which Erik would. He didn't expect him to, but he did, on how to write a hymn. It's if you're familiar with Brian Wren, there's a book that he wrote called Barefoot in the Sand, which is his memoirs, and it's one of the appendices. It's worth reading, and it's about hymn writing. Arguably, from my standpoint, one of the most important things that he did was the organizing of the Dunblane music consultations, because there were a lot of folks involved in that who were part of the Iona community, and the tenets of the community, one of which included working together and collaboration and honesty. And so the way that these consultations worked was we'd all get in a group like this and we'd discuss what's the whole in hymnody, and someone would say, well, there's nothing on social justice or something. I'd be like, right, social justice. And then we'd get everybody talking pro, con, whatever, about what it was. And then folks, were any of you involved with that? None of you here were involved with that? I don't want to say it if you were. But anyway, they were then dismissed to their rooms to write, whether they had written a hymn or not. They were to write, they had all these words floating in their head. So they would go, and then they were to come back, and then they'd put out what they wrote, and the whole group would critique. And the deal was, we're just critiquing. It's nothing personal. You know, I don't hate you because I don't like that word there. And so that whole process, the consultations were from 1962 to 1969. And it started off with just folks in Scotland, but it ended up being broader than that. I mean, British and all that sort of stuff. But that concept of hymn writing, this collaboration, was pretty much launched there. And today, you find that all the time. At the Hymn Society meeting here in July, there was a daily hymn writing thing that you went to, led by Janet Wooten and Andrew Pratt and Jillian Morrison. And I didn't want to go say, you know, it was just what Erik Routley did, because I know people get tired of seeing me coming and going, oh God, she's going to tell us more about Erik Routley. But he started that procedure, and today it's highly normal for me to write a hymn in conjunction with a guy who writes a tune or a woman who writes a tune. You know, I say you know, you're a tune writer and I'm a text writer, so it's like, why don't we do it together? And so we work together, and then maybe I'll send it to you, and you know, send back what you think we should do, which word should be changed. So I think that is very much present, and we don't know it. We don't realize that once upon a time was not the way that you wrote hymns. Also the attention to honesty and the attention to epigrammatic writing, I think. And Dick Watson, who I alluded to, he's on emeritus here at Durham, but he, back in the day, like 1900, we had a reference book called Julian, John Julian. I don't know if any of you know it. It's about, I'm not exaggerating, it's about that thick. Another thing I threw out, because I said I'm never going to use this, and then, Lord, I need it. In America, we don't have Julian in the libraries. So, and of course, the problem with things with that sort of resource, and you know this from other areas, is when it needs upgraded, oh gosh, you know, to upgrade this, I mean, ugh. So the talk from the Hymn Society from the moment it was founded in 1936 was, we got to read you Julian, right, okay. Erik was even involved in that, and what he thought Julian should be rewritten, and how it should be written. And when the whole internet thing came about and whatever, it was Dick who saw the potential for an online resource. And that has come to fruition, and it's called the Canterbury Dictionary of Hymnology, which is astonishing. And Dick is one of the editors here, and a guy named Michael Hahn is the North American editor. As you said, I've written some articles, but that's not, I mean, y'all can write an article. It's not, the articles are very accessible, and they're also very changeable. It's not quite as fanciful as Wikipedia, because you need to go through the editor, and you need to have approval and all that sort of stuff. But if a date is wrong, or a name is wrong, or a new concept has been developed about a certain entry, then it can be updated immediately. And it's Dick who has said that he's still the benchmark. I mean, whether we like him or not, we still go like, oh, well, what does Routley say about this? You know, when we have a problem.
Thank you for that, Sarah. Any other questions or comments that you want to raise, Victoria?
I really enjoyed that, thank you. I have a question. I'm quite aware kind of around the same time, like the 30s to the 60s, there was a real push from figures like George MacLeod or Norman Goodall in the Congregational Church to really connect worship to mission and like worship to the world. So I wonder, like Erik, how, because he seems like he's very pastoral, very focused on his congregation. Was he also well regarded in like missionary circles, and did he work in that field as well?
Yes, very, very much so. From the time he was a student on, he was involved with the with all of the missionary, the London Missionary Society, and then through his hymns, when the World Council of Churches had a book starting way back in like 1922, a little hymn book, song book, essentially called Cantate Domino, which started off with some sort of ecumenical English kind of speaking hymns and stuff in it. And by the time the 50s and 60s and all the issues there had had morphed, the World Council said, okay, we gotta do something with this book, with this hymnal. It's important. We need an ecumenical hymnal, but where, how, why? And so Erik was the editor of that hymnal. Today, if you look, it was published in 1974, and if you look at it today in terms of any of you that are involved with contemporary global hymnody and that sort of thing, you might kind of go, oh, this is what kind of quaint. This is, how cute. But nothing had been done like that before. And there were many hymn writers, Ito Lo, Fred Green actually, but Ito Lo is from Taiwan. A couple of guys from Africa, Tom Colvin, you may know Tom Colvin. Their hymns appeared in that book as completely unknown examples of here. This is from, wherever. And so in that regard, he was a forerunner. He still is. That is, the World Council has not published another book like that. And it was intended to go throughout the world. It was not intended to be denominational. It could be, if you wanted it to be, in your church, but it was everywhere, from cruise ships to conference centers to that sort of stuff. But there was, do you know John Bell?
Yes, we do.
I started to ask. Actually, I'm going to Iona next week. John Bell's there, but whatever. He's tired of me too. But so there's a hymn which you might know. He came down that we may have love. He came down that we may have love. And we're all supposed to go, hallelujah, forevermore. Love that song. And so when the 2013 Presbyterian hymnal came out, I was on the committee that was to do the Erik Routley thing. I knew Erik Routley, but this is what Nicholas thought. And introduce it to different congregations. And in looking for something that was easy to sing and get going, I would use He Came Down. And John will tell you that the inspiration for his gathering and that came from the inspiration that put together Cantate Domino. And so there's that. And then as I was organizing that hymnal, or that lecture, and using that hymn, I said, you know what? That sounds an awful like the Virgin Mary had a baby boy, and the Virgin Mary had a baby boy. Huh, well, it's not again. So, life goes on. I had an occasion to go to Africa. And this also relates not only to my work with hymnology and international hymns, but also with African American spirituals. And I was in Ghana, and if you've ever been to Ghana, and it was stinking hot, and fans going and whatever, and I was listening to this music lecture just like this. And this little teeny guy came on stage, and I couldn't hear him, and I didn't care. So, but he said something, I forget what it was. And the next woman next to me, I said, who is this? And she looked at me, and she said, well, that's Kobina Nkesha, he just died, sort of like the Bartok Kodai of West Africa. I mean, he knew all the hymns and all that sort of stuff. Well, then I perked up, because I knew who he was. But I missed the lecture by that point. So afterwards, I decided no time like the present, and I went up to him, and I said, okay, I got this question. So we got these two songs. He came down, Virgin Mary, and he looked at me, and he hissed at me. He went, and he said, you have a West African tune. And one of the things in the United States is we argue all the time about where spirituals came from, and how they're African, or how they're not, or how they're this, or how they're that. And I looked at him, and he said, the way that you can tell is, he said, by the beginning forth. He came down, that you may have love, the Virgin Mary. Sometimes I feel, or in the reverse, swing low. And he said, the other way that you can tell, and this is the Africanism in them, is because of those notes that we don't know what to do with. He came down, that we may have love. He came down, that we may have love. Or the Virgin Mary had a baby boy. Sometimes I feel like a motherless child. And when you notate those, we don't do the same. We never know what to do. And he said it's because we can't. Because that's a West African musical theory idiom that we cannot relate to. But Africans have no problem. They say, oh, okay, we do this. So that all of that, back to John Bell, his gathering and all of that sort of stuff, came out of the response to Cantate Domino. So it's a huge ripple effect.
Fantastic.
You've given us a great deal, Nancy.
I know, sorry.
No, it's been
And I got more!
no, it's been really very inspiring and you've fed us very richly. Would you like to speculate as to what Erik Routley might make as a state of hymnody now? I'm just thinking of many congregations which no longer use their hymn books, they only use the screen, and they therefore have no idea what the minister's up to or what the worship leader's up to, as to whether that's come from Rejoice and Sing, that's come from the Methodist book, that's come from Mission Praise, or wherever it's appeared from. So they have no idea the provenance of the music, and there are lots of congregations that don't sing anything that approaches to a traditional hymn at all. They sing purely worship songs. So what do you think Routley would make of it now? Would he be in despair about this? Would he have lots of hope?
If he was in a good mood. And his
If he
pipe
had
was
good breakfast.
good mood, and his pipe was full, and he had a glass of whiskey next to him, he would probably say, as long as I said before, as long as it's honest worship, as long as it is an honest representation, it doesn't, and this is hard to do when you're a church musician or running a worship service, as long as it is focused on propagation of the gospel, then, God forbid, go with it. I think he would have trouble. I mean, if he arrived today, he'd be a wreck because it would take him a minute to adjust to all of this. It was turning by the time he died. He could see it coming. And actually, in the back of this book is an appendix, which I think is hilarious. It appeared in the Church Times, and it's about hymnals in 2010. So, which was 30 years later, you know, and it is, I can't describe it all, but if you get a chance to look at it, it's hilarious, and it's true. It says everything that we talked about: print, weight, what's in it, where it's going to go, and he saw it coming. Television changed, you know, that when Billy Graham and all that changed all of that for him, and he saw it coming and was smart enough or prescient enough to know what was going on from what was in his childhood. He would regret, if he were 107 years old, which he would probably be today, he would regret the lack of a hymnal, the lack of a book with all of the things that are in the hymnal. He prescribed that we should know our hymnals, we should study our hymnals, the writing, the poetry, and all that sort of stuff. But I think his curiosity would get the better of him. And he'd kind of go, oh, well, I know, I hate this, but, like, that was good, you know, oh, huh. And so I think there would be a moment of adjustment. He went through several adjustments. He went through the adjustment of television. He went through the adjustment of inclusive language.
Yes.
And came out at the other end. And I think like I started when I said, I think he would get to, as long as it meets our mission as Christians and in Christian worship.
So in a sense, in his own phrase, he would stand aside again.
Yes. Yeah. Good point. Thank you. That's what he would do. I think.
We're just coming up to, that's just after 25 past. Nancy, this has been truly wonderful. It's been, your stories have just been so rich and so alive, and in a wonderful sense. I mean, you talked about the duty and delight, which expresses so much of the theology and the being and the curiosity, and that has come through. But also your duty and delight in the process of what you have discovered in Erik and how you have gone about this. It's been a real privilege to hear. So can we express our thanks?